Welcome to DarkCast Files, your gateway to the darkest corners of the human mind. Here, I bring you chilling, immersive stories where horror and suspense blur the lines between reality and nightmare. So dim the lights, plug in your headphones, and prepare yourself for the unnerving journey ahead. This is DarkCast Files, where every whisper matters and every silence hides a secret. Hit subscribe, and let's dive into the darkness together. It started like all my recordings do, with the soft crackle of the mic, the comforting hiss of background noise, and the thrill of stepping into a world of fiction where I had complete control. The premise was simple. A man discovers strange events unfolding around him that eerily mirror the horror story he's narrating. Creepy? Sure, but just another episode. I had written the outline weeks ago, randomly, lazily, something to fill the late-night content slot. I opened with the narrator hearing scratching inside his walls at night. Nothing groundbreaking, just unsettling enough. I even added a timestamp to make it more real. It started around 2:17 a.m., a low, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on wood. The strange part? When I hit stop on the recording, the silence in my apartment wasn't silence anymore. I swear I heard it, the same scraping sound, faint but real, just beyond my left wall. It stopped the second I moved, like it knew. I laughed it off, told myself it was the power of suggestion. Brains are weird like that. I knew the science. Auditory hallucinations can be triggered by expectation and sleep deprivation. I'd read about it 100 times. Still, something lingered. That night I dreamt of my desk, of my mic turning on by itself, of a script I never wrote typing itself on my laptop. When I woke, everything was normal, except for one thing. The file I had recorded, it wasn't the version I remembered reading. The narration was word for word, but there were new details I never said, about my apartment, my exact layout, the hoodie I wore. Details no one but me would know. I played it back again. Same thing, word perfect, but enhanced. I checked the raw waveform, no edits, no glitches. And when I opened my script file, the additions were there too, inserted seamlessly, as if I'd typed them in a trance. I still wasn't scared. Not really. I told myself I was tired, distracted. Maybe I had added them and forgotten. Maybe I was just that good. It didn't really hit me until the second recording. I continued the story. The fictional man, the narrator, he walks into his kitchen and finds the oven timer blinking 2:17. Just a creepy little beat. But when I got up for coffee afterward, my microwave clock, one I had never set, flashed 217% in slow, pulsing blue digits. And then I saw the second detail. The spoon I dropped earlier, bent at an impossible angle on the floor, just as I had described in the story. That's when the chill set in. Not a jump scare chill. The deep kind, the marrow deep one, where your mind races to disprove what your eyes are telling you. I checked the timestamps again, compared them, dug through backups. Nothing made sense. The files were clean, the edits matched perfectly with no lag, no sign of manipulation. I even ran a checksum. But the more I checked, the more the fiction blurred. My story was writing my life, or my life was becoming the story. I wasn't sure which terrified me more. All I knew was that the deeper I got, the more it felt like someone, or something, was using me as a vessel. And I had already hit record. When I finished recording the first episode, I remember sitting back, feeling a strange mix of relief and something heavier. Not fear, not yet, just discomfort, like something had shifted under me while I was too focused to notice. I saved the file, backed it up twice, and uploaded it to a private folder, just for archiving. Nothing public. I wanted to listen to it again later. Something about the way I'd spoken, the words I'd used, didn't feel like mine. I chalked it up to fatigue. I was narrating a horror story after all. That kind of psychological weight has a way of leaching into your bloodstream without asking permission. But when I played it back later that night, headphones on, lights dimmed the way I always listen to my work, I noticed something I couldn't explain. Not a sound, not an anomaly in the audio levels. It was a sentence, a line I had no memory of writing. The man in the basement doesn't know I'm already dead. That's what I said, in my own voice. Calm, measured, perfectly on beat with the rest of the narration. But here's the thing, I didn't write that. I never even imagined that line. I opened the script file immediately, scrolled line by line through the draft I'd written, and it wasn't there, not even hidden in an old revision. I checked the autosaves, the backups, even used a file recovery tool to see if some earlier version had included it. Nothing, no trace. But there it was in the final audio, embedded like a buried bone, smooth and untraceable. My voice, my pacing, but not my words. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It wasn't me improvising. I never improvise on horror pieces. Everything is too tightly wound, too dependent on pacing. I wouldn't have inserted something like that casually. It was like someone had slipped it into my mouth when I wasn't paying attention. The next morning I took a walk, trying to clear my head. Sometimes when a story crawls too far under your skin, it colors everything. I thought maybe I was spooking myself. Easy to do when you spend your nights recording tales of ghosts and shadows. But there was something different about this. The detail. I hadn't written it, but it felt familiar. Not in the way old dreams feel familiar, more like déjà vu, but stronger, more specific. Like I had heard it before in a memory I hadn't made yet. That line. That one damned line. The man in the basement doesn't know I'm already dead. It haunted me not because it was creepy, but because it felt relevant. Like a warning sent backward in time. I hadn't even written about a basement. My original story was about a missing woman and a house that didn't appear on maps. But now I couldn't stop thinking about basements. I didn't even have one in my building. I live on the 3rd floor of a concrete and drywall apartment box with a rusted elevator and the kind of neighbors who avoid eye contact. There was no basement. At least, I thought there wasn't. That night, I had a dream. Or maybe not a dream, maybe a memory from the wrong angle. I was standing in front of a locked door at the bottom of a stairwell I'd never seen before. My hand was bleeding, badly, and I was holding something heavy wrapped in canvas. I could hear someone crying on the other side of the door, not loud, muffled, like their mouth was covered. I reached for the lock, and just before my fingers touched it, I woke up. Sweat-soaked sheets, pulse hammering. I got up, walked to my desk, opened my recording software, and replayed that first episode again. I needed to hear it one more time. Maybe I imagined the line. Maybe it was a glitch. But there it was, clear, crisp. The man in the basement doesn't know I'm already dead. And this time, I noticed something else. A faint sound layered underneath the words. Static? No, more like a breath. Not mine. It came before I spoke the line. A quiet intake, like someone gathering air just off mic. I ran it through an equalizer, boosted the gain on the lower frequencies. It was there. A voice I didn't recognize, too faint to understand, but undeniably real. That moment broke something open in me. It felt like the story wasn't mine anymore, like I'd become the narrator of something that was already written, somewhere out there, and now it was bleeding into my world, detail by detail. The rest of that week blurred. I couldn't write, couldn't sleep. Every time I tried to draft part 2 of the episode, my hands would hover over the keyboard and my mind would just blank, not writer's block. This was different. Like the story was waiting for me to remember something, not invent it. Like I wasn't creating. It was being uncovered, excavated piece by piece. I kept hearing that line, over and over. It didn't belong, and yet it was central now. I knew it meant something personal. That's when I started going back through old notebooks, scraps of stories I'd written years ago, abandoned scripts, half-formed ideas. I flipped through pages until I found one I didn't recognize, even though it was written in my handwriting. A single page, torn from a legal pad. The top read, episode draft, finale. There was no date, and the paragraph below was a transcript of me describing a house with a locked basement and blood-stained concrete. A woman's muffled scream. A voice from the static. Every sentence was something I hadn't written yet, but somehow had. And at the bottom, in red ink, not mine, don't forget who finishes the story. And that's when it clicked. Not all at once, but like a cold finger tracing the base of my neck. The detail I forgot I remembered wasn't from a past script or an old dream. It hadn't happened yet. It was from a story I hadn't told, a moment waiting for me in the dark. And I realized something worse than fear, worse than confusion. What if the stories I'd been recording weren't fiction at all, but echoes? Echoes of events that hadn't happened yet. Echoes of what I was becoming. I didn't touch the mic for 2 days. That might not sound like much, but for someone like me, whose whole routine is built around structure and control, 2 days of silence feels like drifting. I kept telling myself I just needed space, room to breathe, a break from the story. But the truth was I was scared to speak. Not scared of what I'd say, but scared of what might come through when I did. When you've spent as many hours as I have talking into a mic, editing your own voice, you get used to every inflection, every breath. It becomes predictable, familiar. But now, that certainty had cracked. I no longer trusted my voice. I no longer trusted silence either. It was the third night when it happened. I'd finally mustered up the will to re-record part 2, figuring I could overwrite whatever weirdness had crept in, maybe even rationalize the line, make it part of the story, control the narrative again. I hit record, spoke the intro, and right as I began the first sentence I heard something, not in the room, not through my headphones, but inside the waveform itself. It glitched. A soft blip, almost like a throat clear or a shifted chair, but not mine. I stopped mid-sentence, sat there staring at the screen, the levels steady in green. I rewound, played it back, my voice, then the noise, and then something even stranger. My voice continued, but I wasn't talking anymore. The words were mine, the tone, the rhythm, but it wasn't me speaking. I hadn't recorded past that sentence. I checked the timestamp. I'd recorded 32 seconds. The file was 1 minute and 41 seconds long. I scrubbed forward. The extra audio didn't sound distorted or corrupted. It sounded finished, like I'd completed the episode, top to bottom, but with sentences I hadn't even conceived yet. Phrases that connected to things I hadn't uncovered, names I hadn't researched. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I didn't move. I just stared. And then I played the last 20 seconds. That's when I heard the noise again. Not static, not digital artifacting. It was wet, like something dragged across concrete, something alive, not footsteps, not quite. It had rhythm but no pattern, like breath and muscle trying to crawl through a tunnel too small. I muted my mic, checked the room. Nothing. Dead quiet. No neighbors upstairs, no pipes. But when I played the file again, it was still there, embedded, permanent, a sound I never recorded, but was now part of the story. And here's the part that really lodged under my skin. When I ran the audio through spectral analysis, something I do when I'm mastering an episode for clarity, the waveform revealed something that shouldn't exist. The noise wasn't ambient. It had structure, frequencies that lined up into symmetrical peaks, almost like speech. Not human speech, not words, but intent. There's no other way to describe it. It was like the sound wanted something. I isolated the frequency, looped it, slowed it down. That's when I heard it. A whisper, low and slow, tucked beneath the dragging sound. A single word, again. Again. It said it 3 times, spaced 7 seconds apart. Always the same word, always in the same pitch. And this wasn't a file corruption or coincidence. I know how digital noise works. I know glitches. This was surgical, designed. Like someone or something had placed it there with purpose. I closed the program, disconnected my mic, shut everything down. But the noise didn't stop. It was in my head now. Not an earworm, not a memory. It followed me. In the hum of the refrigerator, in the slow spin of the ceiling fan, even in the shower where the water hit the tiles just right. I could hear it beneath everything, a dragging, crawling, whispering sound, always followed by that single word, like it was waiting for me to do something. Again. I tried recording myself speaking gibberish, random sentences, talking about the weather, nothing about the story. Then I'd play it back, and somehow still the noise would find its way into the recording. Never at the same moment, never at the same volume. But always there, nested beneath my voice like a hidden track. The whisper never changed. Again. That night, I slept with the mic unplugged, the laptop turned off, every light in the apartment on. I kept trying to convince myself this was some kind of psychological loop. Auditory pareidolia. My brain, desperate to find meaning in chaos. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't fear. It was instruction, and I'd already obeyed it once, by narrating a story I thought I was writing but was really remembering. So I opened the file again, played the unknown voice, the version of me that had completed the episode without my input, and I wrote down every word, every phrase, every unnatural detail, because whether I liked it or not, the story had decided to write itself, and it was using my voice to do it. And now, every time I hit record, I wonder if I'm narrating my own future, or if I'm being recorded by something else, something older, something that's been listening longer than I've been alive, a noise I didn't record, but now can't stop hearing. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach, like I'd swallowed something bitter in my sleep. The whisper from the audio file, the dragging noise that wasn't there but somehow was. Everything was bleeding into my waking hours now. I knew I had to look at the document again, the one I'd been working on to transcribe that mysterious extended recording I never made. I opened my laptop, fingers trembling slightly, and pulled up the Google Docs file where I'd started typing the words that weren't mine, but somehow had spilled from my voice anyway. What I saw on that screen made my breath hitch. The document had changed overnight. It wasn't just the usual autosave updates or my clumsy typing errors. Entire paragraphs, sentences, even entire scenes had been added. Words I didn't remember writing, descriptions of places I hadn't researched, dates and times that hadn't existed in my timeline. The story was evolving by itself. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of glitch. Google Docs sometimes has weird sync issues. Maybe my phone or tablet had auto-edited it somehow. I checked the version history. There were edits, yes, but they all showed as made by me. No other user access, no other sign of tampering. The timestamps, though, they didn't make sense. Edits appeared minutes before I had even woken up, or during times when I was sure I'd closed the laptop. I scrolled through the document slowly, heart pounding. It described scenes with alarming detail, places I had never visited but suddenly knew, faces I hadn't seen but somehow could picture perfectly. It spoke of events that, according to my own calendar, hadn't happened yet. It mentioned a date 2 weeks from now, a date I hadn't even planned anything for. I felt the weight of it settle on me like ice. This wasn't just a story being written on its own. It was a script for something that was about to happen, or maybe something I was about to cause. The lines blurred between creation and prediction. Was I authoring my future, or was my future authoring me? The logic part of me screamed that this was impossible. The scientific mind inside refused to accept that a document stored on a cloud could have knowledge of events that hadn't unfolded. I went back to basic principles. There is no time travel in any verified scientific model we understand. The past influences the present, yes, but the future? Not supposed to. Yet here was this file, this digital ghost, mapping out a future I hadn't lived yet but was somehow meant to live. I tried to rationalize it with some psychology. Perhaps I was experiencing an extreme form of cryptomnesia, unconsciously recalling things I had read or heard somewhere and believing them to be new. Or maybe it was a form of dissociation, where my mind was fabricating details to fill gaps caused by stress and anxiety. But the level of detail in the writing was too precise. The descriptions included specific weather patterns, traffic details, even snippets of conversations I couldn't have overheard. I cross-checked with weather archives, and surprisingly, some of the forecasts matched current meteorological models for those future dates. If it was fiction, it was an eerie kind of accuracy. I began keeping a log, marking each new addition to the document and comparing it to what actually happened as the days passed. At first, the correlation was small, minor details like a missed train or an unexpected thunderstorm. But as time went on, the lines between fiction and reality became indistinguishable. The document predicted minor incidents that happened exactly as written: a spilled coffee at the corner cafe, a flat tire on my way home, even a random encounter with a stranger at the grocery store. I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. The future was unfolding right there in my Google Docs, one word at a time. The realization hit me like a punch. If this document was truly a window into what was coming, then what else was it hiding? What darker parts of the story were still unwritten? What did it want from me? Every time I tried to stop reading, to close the laptop and walk away, some part of me was drawn back in by a mixture of fear and curiosity. a compulsion I couldn't explain. The story wasn't just on the screen. It was inside my head, bleeding into my thoughts, shaping my actions, and pulling me toward a future I hadn't chosen, but was rapidly becoming inevitable. So I kept typing. I added notes, observations, warnings, hoping to wrest control back from whatever force was behind this. I documented the strange additions, the impossible knowledge, the creeping feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by time itself. As if the past, present, and future had tangled together, and I was caught in the middle, narrating a story that was no longer mine, but something far older and more powerful. The document became my obsession, my tether to sanity and madness all at once, because I was starting to understand this wasn't just a story about horror or suspense. This was a story about fate, control, and the terrifying illusion of free will. And as the nights grew longer, and the edits kept coming, I realized one chilling truth. The story wasn't just in my Google Docs. The story was inside me. It was writing me. Late one night, when the apartment was drenched in silence, and the only light came from the soft glow of my laptop screen, I decided to record a new episode. My voice, still trembling, filled the room, the mic picking up every breath, every slight hesitation. I was trying to piece together everything. The audio glitches, the mysterious edits, the creeping sense that the story was alive and watching me. But I needed to hear my own voice again. I thought if I could just speak the truth, maybe I could break the cycle. I pressed record, and as the words spilled out, something shifted in the air. The room seemed to hum faintly, like the low drone of a distant engine, and the static in my headphones suddenly grew louder, thickening into a murmur that I couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was interference, a signal bleed from some nearby radio station or electrical device. I checked every cable, unplugged everything unnecessary, moved the microphone to different spots. But no matter what I did, the static returned, always with the same unsettling pattern. It wasn't random noise. Hidden beneath the white hiss were faint, rhythmic pulses, an almost imperceptible cadence that matched the beat of my own heart. I closed my eyes, listened intently, and then I heard it, a voice. Not clear words, but a fractured whisper, like someone speaking underwater, distorted yet unmistakably human. It came from the static, a spectral presence trapped inside the interference. I replayed the recording again and again, trying to isolate the voice. It wasn't any language I recognized, but the cadence had an eerie familiarity. It almost sounded like a warning, or a plea. My scientific brain raced to find a logical explanation. Was it a form of auditory pareidolia, my mind trying to find patterns where none existed? Could it have been some kind of subliminal message embedded by hackers or pranksters? I ran the audio through filters, slowed it down, sped it up, reversed it. Sometimes the whisper sounded like a name. Sometimes it was just a tone that sent chills down my spine. But whatever it was, it felt deliberate, like it was trying to communicate with me specifically. I tried replicating the experiment, recording late into the night, tuning my equipment, adjusting frequencies, but the voice only appeared when I was speaking about the story, when I was narrating the unfolding events of the document, the creeping horror I was living. When I switched topics or talked about something mundane, the static returned to normal white noise, clean and lifeless. It was as if the story itself was alive in the radio waves, and it wanted me to listen. The voice wasn't just in my headphones either. It began to invade other devices, my phone, the TV, even the digital clock on my bedside table. Random static bursts would morph into fleeting whispers when no one else was around. I was becoming obsessed with these moments, desperate to catch the voice clearly, desperate to understand what it wanted. I researched everything: radio frequency interference, electronic voice phenomena, binaural beats, even the psychology of auditory hallucinations. Nothing explained the precision or the timing. And then, one night, while playing back a particularly long recording, the static broke apart and the voice grew clear enough to utter a chilling phrase: "Finish it." No context, no explanation, just those two words hanging in the air, heavy and demanding. My skin prickled. I felt a presence, like I was being watched through the speakers, judged by an invisible audience waiting for me to complete something I didn't yet understand. That's when I realized the story wasn't just writing itself on my screen. It was speaking directly to me through the static, through the electronic hum of the devices I used every day. The voice from the static wasn't a glitch. It was a summons, a command. It was the story reaching out, dragging me deeper into the narrative, beyond what I had chosen to share, beyond what I thought was fiction. And the terrifying truth settled over me like a suffocating fog. I wasn't just narrating the story anymore. I was part of it. The voice wasn't just in the recording. It was inside me, whispering from the edges of my consciousness, waiting for me to finish what had already begun. The days that followed felt like I was trapped in a loop, but not the kind you'd expect. It wasn't a simple Groundhog Day reset or a cliché time loop where everything repeated exactly the same. No, it was far more unsettling, because the loop was going backward, creeping into my past, rewriting it as I moved forward. Every time I opened that Google Docs file, every time I listened to the recordings, the details began shifting, subtly at first, then with more alarming clarity. Memories I had been sure of started to feel fuzzy, like peeling paint on a wall, revealing layers I didn't recognize underneath. Faces, places, conversations I once remembered clearly were suddenly blank or replaced by events I had no recollection of living through. I found myself retracing steps I was convinced I'd already taken, but the reality was different. The coffee shop where I always ordered the same black brew now had a different layout, a different barista's face behind the counter. The old bookstore where I swore I bought my first notebook was gone, replaced by a vacant lot. Even my own apartment seemed altered. The furniture rearranged, small objects moved or missing, like my life was being edited alongside the story. The past wasn't stable, it was fluid, and it was changing to fit the narrative that kept unfolding in my documents and recordings. I tried to anchor myself with photos and videos from my phone, digital timestamps I thought would prove the past hadn't changed, but even those were not immune. One morning, scrolling through my gallery, I noticed pictures that shouldn't have existed, snapshots of places I never visited, people I never met, moments I never lived. Others that should have been there were suddenly deleted, like ghosts erased by a digital hand. It was as if the story was bleeding beyond my writing, beyond my recordings, infecting my reality and rewriting it in real time. The sensation was disorienting, terrifying. It felt like living inside a dream where the rules kept shifting beneath my feet, where I was both the observer and the participant in a reality I no longer controlled. I questioned my own mind. Was this a form of psychosis triggered by stress and sleepless nights? Was my brain fracturing under the weight of the story? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize, the evidence was tangible and undeniable. The world around me was bending backward, conforming to a story I hadn't finished writing yet it was already reshaping what had come before. I began documenting these shifts meticulously, noting every change in my journal, trying to map the distortions like a scientist studying an unstable phenomenon. I tried to stay grounded, telling myself that no matter how much the past was rewritten, my consciousness remained constant. But even that certainty faltered. I started experiencing moments of déjà vu layered with unfamiliarity, memories that felt familiar but were impossible, memories I couldn't place in time. I couldn't tell if they were remnants of the original past or fragments of the altered one. The more I observed, the more the looping backward revealed a dark irony. The closer I got to finishing the story, the more my own past slipped away from me, as if the narrative demanded a clean slate. It wanted me to forget who I was to become who I was destined to be within its pages. And with every passing day, I felt the walls of my identity cracking, fragments of my former self dissolving into the fiction that was now my reality. Scientific explanations failed me here. The idea of retrocausality, the notion that future events can influence the past, is a debated topic in quantum physics, but no one has ever experienced it firsthand on a macroscopic human scale. Yet, here I was, living proof of something that defied every known law of time and space. The story wasn't just predicting the future anymore, it was unmaking the past, folding it back into itself like a Mobius strip with no beginning or end. And as the lines blurred, I understood the chilling truth. I was caught in a temporal feedback loop of my own creation, a story folding back onto itself, dragging me relentlessly toward an ending I could neither escape nor rewrite. The past was no longer a memory but a blank canvas, and the narrative was the brush painting over everything I thought I knew. I was living backward, spiraling deeper into a fiction that wasn't fiction at all, and the only way out was to finish the story, even if that meant losing myself completely in the process. There was a moment when I realized something was missing, not from my life, but from the story itself. The document, my recordings, the fragments of this haunting narrative were all there, yet one episode, the one I was sure I had planned to write next, was nowhere to be found. It was as if that part of the story had been erased, deleted before it ever existed, leaving a gaping hole in the sequence of events that I could neither explain nor ignore. I scoured my files, combed through backup drives, searched every corner of my digital archives, but the unwritten episode was simply absent, like a page torn out of a diary. That gap became an obsession. It hovered over everything else, a question mark that refused to be resolved. What was so important that the story itself had decided to leave it blank? What horrors or revelations was I meant to uncover in that missing chapter? Every time I tried to move forward, my mind circled back to that void, a silent scream in the middle of my narrative. I felt like I was chasing shadows, trying to fill in blanks that were never meant to be filled, or worse, that should never be filled. The paradox weighed heavily on me. If the story was alive, if it was shaping reality and dragging me through time loops and whispered commands, then the absence of this episode must mean something. It was a warning, a boundary I wasn't supposed to cross. But human curiosity is relentless, especially when faced with the unknown. I began piecing together fragments of clues from the episodes that surrounded it, snippets of dialogue I never spoke aloud, fleeting images in my mind's eye, feelings I couldn't explain. Slowly, a shape emerged from the void, a narrative thread that was too dangerous to document directly, a truth too dark to confront head-on. This unwritten episode felt like the heart of the entire story, the core where fiction bled into reality so deeply that it threatened to consume me. It was the moment when everything I thought I knew would shatter, when the veil between narrator and narrative would lift completely. I sensed that whatever happened there would either break the cycle I was trapped in or pull me irreversibly into its depths. The story wasn't just incomplete, it was alive with potential, a slumbering beast waiting to be awakened by the wrong word, the wrong sentence. Scientific logic offers no comfort here. There is no empirical framework to explain a story that edits itself, that erases parts of its own existence, that becomes a trap for its own creator. All I could do was listen, to the silence left by the missing episode, to the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. The absence was louder than any word I could write, a void that echoed with unspoken terrors. And so, I stand on the edge of that blank page, caught between the desire to know and the fear of what that knowledge might bring. The unwritten episode isn't just a missing chapter, it's a mirror held up to my own unraveling mind, reflecting the part of the story and myself that I dare not face. To finish the story, I will have to write it. But to write it, I must first survive it. The question gnawed at me relentlessly. What would happen if I simply stopped? If I stopped narrating, stopped recording, stopped giving life to this story that seemed to be writing me just as much as I was writing it? The voice I'd trusted to guide me through the maze of shifting realities suddenly felt like a lifeline dangling over an abyss. I wasn't just telling a story anymore. I was tethered to it by every word spoken, every sentence breathed into existence. I wondered if silence would be my salvation or my doom. Would the narrative unravel without my voice, or would it persist, twisting and turning, even without me to anchor it? I thought about the physics of sound, how sound waves need a medium, a source, a listener. Without the source, the vibrations cease, the story should die, right? But this wasn't a normal story, and I wasn't a normal narrator. The static on my recordings whispered something different. There was power in the act of speaking, in the sustained act of narration, that felt almost like a spell. When I stopped talking, the silence was oppressive, as if the story itself waited, hungry, for the next word. It was in that silence I realized the story fed on my voice. Without it, the whole fragile construct might collapse, or something worse might fill the void. The moments when I hesitated, when I paused mid-narration to consider just not continuing, were the most terrifying. It wasn't just fear of losing control, it was a deep, primal sense that something was listening, something alive inside the story's margins, waiting to pounce if I dared go quiet. I could almost feel it pressing against the edges of my mind, a pressure that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I tried to measure that pressure, to understand it in terms of brain chemistry or psychological tension, but nothing fit. It was as if the story's energy coalesced in the spaces between words, in the breath before the next phrase, and that energy demanded to be released. Yet the paradox remained. Could continuing to narrate keep me safe, or was it dragging me deeper into a trap? Each word added to the story seemed to pull me further down the rabbit hole, entangling my reality with the fiction until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I felt trapped between speaking and silence, between control and surrender. The story was no longer just mine. It was a creature I'd breathed into existence, and it demanded an audience, demanded a voice. I experimented with brief silences, holding my breath, letting the microphone capture nothing but static and my own uneven heartbeat. And in those silent moments, the static would flare up, crackle with strange bursts of sound, half words, whispers, distorted fragments that made no sense yet felt like warnings. It was as if the story was trying to speak without me, using the silence as a medium, bending the nothingness into something unnerving and alive. In that tension, I understood that my voice was both shield and key. Speaking was an act of resistance against the unraveling, but also a surrender to the story's insatiable hunger for life. The more I spoke, the more the story grew, but stopping meant risking everything unraveling, or something else taking over. And so, caught in that impossible balance, I keep talking, because I don't know what happens if I stop, but I'm terrified to find out. There came a point when I stopped being the storyteller and realized I had become the story itself. It was no longer a matter of me narrating events from a safe distance or dissecting them with cold logic. I was woven into the very fabric of the narrative, my identity dissolving and reforming with every sentence I spoke, every word I typed. The boundaries between author and subject blurred until they vanished entirely. I wasn't just telling a story, I was living it, shaped and reshaped by the story's relentless momentum. It's a strange, disorienting feeling to look in the mirror and question whether the person staring back is the you who started this journey, or some fragmented version sculpted by the tale you thought you controlled. The story's influence seeped into my thoughts, my memories, even my emotions. It began to dictate not just what I said, but how I felt, what I feared, what I hoped for. The lines of my own consciousness started echoing with the narrative's pulse, sinking in rhythms I could neither resist nor fully understand. I tried to analyze it scientifically, wondering if what I was experiencing could be explained by something like cognitive infiltration or psychogenic fugue, where the mind creates alternate identities or memories as a coping mechanism. But this wasn't a typical mental health crisis. It was more like a feedback loop between thought and story, a recursive system where each influenced the other until they became indistinguishable. The story wasn't just recorded in my mind, it was encoded in my very being. As I continued to narrate, I noticed how the story anticipated my responses, my choices, the very direction my life seemed to take. It was as if the narrative had a consciousness of its own, learning and adapting, guiding me toward an ending I had never imagined but was powerless to avoid. The more I spoke, the more I felt like a puppet on invisible strings, dancing to the tune of a script I hadn't written yet, but that was already written inside me. This realization was terrifying. The story was no longer a creation, it was a force-shaping reality, bending me to its will and erasing the distinction between what was real and what was fabricated. I was trapped inside a story that wrote me as much as I wrote it, and I was beginning to understand that to finish the tale was to finish myself. To find closure in the narrative might mean losing the self that had existed before this nightmare began. And yet, there was a strange, almost hypnotic pull to it all. To be part of something greater than myself, a story so powerful it could rewrite time, memory, and identity. I felt both prisoner and participant, terrified and fascinated. This was no longer just a horror story or a thriller, it was the ultimate psychological labyrinth, a narrative Ouroboros, devouring and recreating the storyteller from the inside out. In the end, the story that wrote me was a reflection of the darkest parts of human experience, the fear of losing control, the fragility of identity, the terrifying unknown lurking beneath everyday reality. It was a mirror held up to my own unraveling mind, and by telling it, I was both confronting and becoming that terror. The question now wasn't what would happen next, but who I was becoming as the story continued to unfold. The final draft, they say, is where everything comes together, the culmination of a story's chaos, the resolution of all loose ends, the moment when all mysteries are laid bare. But for me, the final draft wasn't a neat conclusion. It was more like stepping off a cliff into an abyss where the ground vanished beneath my feet, and the only thing left was the uncertain air of what came next. As I began to write what I knew was the end, the weight of everything I had experienced settled heavy in my chest. The story that had consumed me, reshaped me, haunted me, now demanded its conclusion, and I was both terrified and strangely calm to face it. I knew the final draft wouldn't be just words on a page or sounds through a microphone. It was a living thing, woven into the fabric of my reality, pulsing with every breath I took. I felt it in the tremor of my hands as I typed, in the hollow echo of my own voice bouncing back at me through the empty room. The story was no longer a story. It was my life, my past, my future, collapsed into a single narrative thread that I could neither sever nor fully embrace. As I put the pen to paper, or rather my fingers to keyboard, I realized the final draft was an act of surrender, not defeat, but acceptance. Acceptance that I was no longer just the narrator, but part of something much larger, something beyond explanation or escape. The logic and science I had clung to slipped away here, replaced by something more primal, more elemental. This was the raw core of the unknown, the place where stories become reality, and reality becomes story. I wrote with the knowledge that every word might be the last, that finishing the story could either free me or bind me forever. The tension was unbearable, like holding my breath underwater, waiting for the moment I had to surface or drown. And yet there was a strange clarity in that pressure, a sharp focus that cut through the fog of confusion and fear. The final draft was a reckoning, a moment of truth where I faced the darkness I had summoned and found, to my surprise, that I was still here. But the story didn't end with a bang or a neat resolution. It ended with a whisper, a quiet fading of the voice that had carried me through this nightmare. The final draft wasn't an ending. It was a pause, a breath, a silent space where the story could either rest or begin anew. And in that silence, I understood something profound. Stories are never truly finished. They live on in the spaces between words, in the hearts of those who listen, in the shadows where reality blurs into fiction. So here I am, telling you this, not as a warning or a confession, but as a testament to the strange power of stories, to their ability to shape us, haunt us, and sometimes to rewrite our very lives. I don't know what happens after this final draft. Maybe it's freedom, maybe it's something else entirely. But one thing is certain, once you start a story like this, it never really ends. It just waits for the next voice, the next breath, the next telling. And now, I pass the microphone to you. What will you do with the story that writes itself?